Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. My guest this episode is K.A. Doore, author of The Perfect Assassin. It's a suspense-driven fantasy adventure set in a sand-strewn city of platforms rising above the desert wastes. There, a young historian takes his first rooftop leaps into the life of an assassin, a noble family tradition with definitive rules of conduct and contracts. But when he discovers the body of a prominent city leader, it falls on his shoulders to solve the crime before conspiratorial intrigue and angry spirits tear his world apart. The Perfect Assassin is a unique coming-of-age story entwining reluctant romance with murder mystery, and it's available now from Tor Books, and the follow-up novel, The Impossible Contract, arrives in stores on November 12th. And Kai, welcome to Fictitious.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
This is a really unique story, a unique world, a very interesting character in the world of assassins. But can you kind of tell me more about this story and the role of an assassin in this culture? Because I think it's very different from a lot of the other fantasy stories that I've seen, where assassins are like empathy, less killers, and it's this a solid cool factor. And here the assassin is much more of a respected tradition, and not necessarily something that's about like the cool factor of killing, but more doing a service to the community, if that makes sense.
It does help that the main character kind of starts out as a historian, so he's already that much more of a nerd than perhaps most other assassins in fantasy. I started out writing about assassins for the cool factor, and then somehow stumbled into this moral gray area of wanting to step away from that whole body count thing, basically. In a lot of other fantasy novels, it's all about the body count, the kill count, the number of people you can just wipe off the page. There's nameless guards and nameless other characters who die and nothing happens. And I really wanted to take a step back and kind of interrogate that, especially with respect to an assassin who perhaps that wasn't his first choice in careers.
I'm a fan of at least a few of the Assassin's Creed games. But yeah, those are games where you walk around just shivving people all the time. I mean, every time you play, you're just wiping out hundreds of people. And one, it's almost like Doritos, crunch all you want, they'll make more. New bad guys appear constantly. Yeah, but there's very little consequence to it. In this world, you've got this really interesting piece of the lore of the world where you've got a different word for it, but the people's souls, when they leave their body at death, can become these sort of dangerous, angry spirits. How did you come across that kind of concept, and what did that give you as far as a piece of storytelling mechanic to, change the relationship of people with death and with being an assassin?
So it's hard to talk about the first book without also acknowledging that I wrote The Impossible Contract first. So a lot of the world building I did in that book. And I started writing that book wanting basically to write about necromancy. The spirits, the genre were kind of my response to wanting to write about necromancy and then kind of exploring it from there. They were originally inspired kind of by wanting to have spirits that you could bind to corpses, which might be a little bit of a spoiler for book 2. It's also hard to remember back to all the research that I did around that time, because I just basically had started writing the story, and then I went back and I started doing research on deserts and cultures in deserts, and on ancient Egypt, honestly, as well, and a bunch of other things, and kind of started thinking about this concept of two pieces of a person. You have your soul and you have your body. And for them to really function, they have to function together. And so if you have them out of balance anyway, then that way lies madness, basically. So when people die, their spirits, if they're not carefully attended to, tend to go awry. And usually if they die out in the desert, which is where they're not usually tended to, they just kind of fall apart into weaker versions of their former selves, but they can still possess people. If you get possessed by a spirit, you have two spirits in you, and then you just go out of balance, and that's when you start going a little crazy. So that's kind of where that had started. And then when I pulled back and started writing The Perfect Assassin, which is basically a prequel to the other book, I wanted to really start looking more into the genre and what they were in this world. And the idea that once you die, you have a limited amount of time before your spirit basically becomes unbound from your body. And in that period of time, that's when priests within the world can kind of stop that process and make sure that the spirit is still bound to the body. But if isn't taken care of, then you have a very angry, very strong spirit out there trying to basically find a body so that it can be its whole again. But it can never really be its whole again because all those bodies it finds tend to have spirits already in them. So it was a long, elaborate way of saying they're basically spirits.
The assassins in this story, they are aware that when somebody is killed, that they must be found quickly. So unlike a lot of other ideas where it's like kill somebody, hide the body, or like stash them away or something like that, this is very the opposite here, because they're aware that there's a delicate balance of how the spirits work with life and with the people around them. And they know that they release something very dangerous if it's not taken care of. And I like that idea that there's this additional responsibility. So it's not just the video game idea of assassin where you whack somebody and then just move on. Here, they have to be very conscious of, if I do kill somebody, it has to be with purpose and it has to be under contract, because that is part of their social contract with the world around them, is that they have to be sort of commissioned to make these kills. But then in turn, they make sure that the body is found in a very quick fashion so that it can be tended to, because the Jean run loose is a very bad thing. And the main character of the story is absolutely terrified of them. And I thought that was an interesting thing of like, here's somebody who his job that he's not super excited about actually doing is to kill, but in turn, it could potentially release the thing he's most scared of. That was a really fun way to put a character into conflict there.
Yeah, because not only does he not really want to kill people, but also once he does, he has this corpse on his hands and also this angry spirit. And it is like the thing he is most terrified of.
So Amastan, like you said, he's a historian, he's a scribe, he's somebody who spends most of his days with scrolls and vellum and ink and writing things down, but yet he is part of a family and has been chosen to be part of this elite group of people who are being trained in as assassins. And when a prominent chief gets killed and gets left in a place where the body isn't found in time, and that releases the Johnny like into the world, and suddenly Amastan is tasked with trying to find out why this thing happened. And basically he's trying to do detective work. And I think there's an interesting thing that this book kind of takes a turn into being kind of an investigation murder mystery story. I want to kind of dive into like what brought you to do that kind of story with it. And then I definitely want to hear about how you wrote Impossible Contract first, and then the novel that ends up being the first one released is more like prequel. That's a fascinating place to be as an author in the world of publishing, because I don't think most people would even know how to deal with having written a book and then, oh, I need to write a whole first one before this one can come out. Let's explore that investigative aspect first and then swing back around.
Yeah. So I kind of had been throwing this out there. When I was writing it with a blurb that was basically, this is about a historian who's turned into a detective who's not really good at being a detective at all. The idea for this story started out as kind of a spy versus spy kind of idea, except more assassin versus assassin. I never really saw it initially as a mystery or a murder mystery until probably like the third or fourth draft. And after I'd given it to my betas and they came back and they're like, this is a good mystery. And I was like, oh, it's a mystery, is it? That's great. Cool. It's a mystery now. So I ended up actually multiple drafts after that, I ended up tweaking that and pulling in more of the mystery aspect and trying to beef that up a little bit more. But yeah, initially I thought of it more as the fisticuffs, stab sort of thing, but on a quieter level, because Amastan is a quieter level kind of human being. And because I was also trying to keep that body count low, because I was trying to interrogate the whole, like, what is a serial killer and what is an assassin? Like, what is the difference between the two of those? One of them really enjoys their job, but one of them also really enjoys their job. One of them paid for it is really the thing there. I was interrogating that, and I was also just trying to understand Amastan, who's honestly he's just a quieter kind of person, and he would rather just sit with his scrolls than be out there stabbing people. Like, that's not what he wants to do. That's what Menna wants to do. That's what his other cousins want to be doing. But he's the one who found the corpse, so it's up to him.
I really liked that interplay where when Amastan's at the beginning of the story is finishing his training to take on this role, and he has like three other of the cousins who are also going through these tests to kind of solidify this thing, and they have a trainer who is essentially kind of an assassin who's been outed. So people in the community are aware of her and her reputation. And so there's limitations on the stuff that she can do anymore, even though she's still very connected and very, very dangerous. But like you said, like he has his cousin Mena, who she is far more of the aggro, intense, like excited to do the thing. And her day job essentially is to care for the dead and to care for the Jean and the leaving of the spirit. And on the flip side of it, she's more or less like, this job is awesome. Let's run around rooftops and kick ass and maybe kill some people. And Amastan's like, I mean, okay, but I mean, this was a neat challenge, but can I go back to my books? And I liked that dichotomy a lot because he's just not the kind of character that you normally see wielding the knife in these stories. Did the and I guess this is such a complicated question because of the Impossible Contract having been written first, but did Amastan as a character come first, or did the plot and the story come first, and then you kind of which informed which?
Amastan was definitely first. He's a side character in the Impossible Contract, but there was a whole backstory that I knew that if I had to go back and write earlier, that I would be writing that. That actually is what transpires before The Perfect Assassin. So I kind of had that plot to go off of and bridge the gap between. But Amastan was he was the key character, and kind of understanding how he became, because in the Impossible Contract, he's like, he's in his prime, he knows what he's doing, but he's still the same guy. He's still this like steady, bookish, not someone you would expect to go out and stab anybody. So then coming back and writing The Perfect Assassin was just kind of exploring, how do you get somebody to have that kind of balance of like, they're very good at what they do. They don't necessarily want to do it, but they're still very good at it. So that was that through line.
I mean, you've got several layers of character that I think are unusual to like the most traditional idea of this kind of character. Like we've already touched on, like he's a quiet, kind of nervous character, at least in the first book, but he's also ace. He thinks of himself as asexual and has a visceral reaction when people, like even people are teasing him about like, oh, kissing and flirting and stuff like that. And he has that like, why would anybody want to do that? I don't want to do that. Keep that away from me. But he is also queer in a world that I think is refreshingly open about all those things. Like, there isn't any of like, oh my gosh, this person's gay or whatever. Like it's just part of the world. And which is a thing that like we've seen a lot in conversation about fantasy worlds these days. You don't need to have an oppressive element without exploring it. And we don't have to mirror our world and the problems that we have in it in a fantasy world. We can explore worlds where those things can be open and equal and normal and not dealing with like a lot of the crap that we have to deal with on a regular basis. So in exploring that character, like, were those things that like you knew about him immediately, or did you discover those during the writing process? Is that something that developed out as like the more you got to know him, the more you found those things out about him?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I knew going into it that he was interested in men, and I knew he was at least on the ace scale somewhere. I think originally I thought he was more on the demi scale than straight up ace, but it was definitely in writing it and seeing how he reacted to the other characters, and ultimately seeing how my betas reacted to it, and then realizing that he was in fact ace, and then dialing that up a little bit more to make it completely obvious, because the last thing I wanted was people going into it and being like, is he though? Not sure. I really wanted that on the page, that he is, without actually coming out and saying, hey, I'm asexual, because they don't really have that word in this society.
Making something like that contextually obvious while not having the vernacular for it. We have all the words for it now in current present society, but not everybody knows them, right? So like, even when you mention like a demisexual or something like that, like there's going to be a chunk of the listenership that's going to be like, oh man, now I have to Google something, right? Like to kind of understand what those things are. And I think that's healthy. It's great to be introduced to something and being like, oh, I can now expand my understanding of the world because I have a word for it now. With the beta readers, is that something you needed to kind of almost treat like a sensitivity read, like as far as exploring with people and figuring out like, does this speak to you as openly as I need it to? Am I still, like you said, you kind of had to tweak it and make it a little bit more explicit. Like, what was that process like?
Yeah, it was mostly feeling out their reactions to it. I would have questions about what they thought he was sexuality wise, honestly, and what they wanted more of. And then it was just basically I went in and I did just tweak a few lines here and there just to make it more clear. Yeah, that was pretty much all I really had to do. And then I went back before betas readers again, and they were a little bit more, they understood where I was going with it at that point, and I was happier with that.
I think also something that I would say that breaks convention here is that most of the time, if you have a story like this with assassin or aggressive characters, killers, whatever like that, if there is any kind of relationship in the books, they tend to mirror that aggression. There's always kind of like this contention that informs those relationships. And in this one, there's the relationship that blossoms between Amastan and another character that he meets is far gentler. I saw it described as like gentle and bittersweet. And that makes a lot of sense. And again, plays against type. So I feel like there's a lot about this novel that plays against type, does not go with precisely where we'd expect the tropes to go. I find that super refreshing, because I don't like seeing the same thing over and over. But when you talk to your editors, your publishers, and when you're finding readers and the fans out there for it, what is that reaction when they encounter this where it kind of defies so much of what you would traditionally see on the market?
Honestly, it's been really positive. I think I've seen maybe one or two reviews where people were really confused about what was going on. But I think it's been positive because there's such a dearth. And I think it's been positive because it's been true to Amastan's character. Like if I tried to shoehorn some kind of angry rage relationship or something, that just wouldn't have worked for him.
And then this world that it takes place in, or at least the city where this story is transpiring, it's in these deserts, but they're built on platforms. And so you talk about they're several hundred feet in the air. In order to get down lower, there's sort of these carriages that you would have to take down. And the platforms, like when people are moving from one to the next, I mean, there's bridges and stuff to it. So it's like kind of a fascinating place because it feels very different from a lot of the other settings that I've seen. Was this based on any particular real world thing that inspired it? Or, where did you kind of come up with that concept?
So it was 100% based on, I was reading about deserts and I was reading about the Sahara, and there was just this one paragraph in a book that was talking about one of these villages on the edge of the Sahara where people had to sweep out the sand every day because otherwise the town would be just completely subsumed by dunes. That just started this whole cascade of thoughts of like, well, okay, what if you didn't want to do that? How would you keep the dunes out? What if you elevated them a little bit? What if you had elevated them while the dunes were mostly around there and the dunes continued onwards, and then suddenly like you have 100 feet more of elevation than you did when you started? So there's a little bit of that history in the book that it basically, these were supposed to be like stabilized platforms in the middle of a shifting sea of sand. But over time, the sand moved so that they were actually further and further up and away from it. And that had a tendency to isolate the city.
I like the idea that being up so high has basically isolated them from bandits and attackers and things. Like it's part of the defensive nature of it. I couldn't help think about the idea that these people are living their entire lives hundreds of feet in the air, where the edge of a platform is a very long drop down below. And early on, we see Amastan kind of recognize that because he has to descend from one platform and run to another across a much more dangerous kind of landscape. But most of the people are just going about their existence just high up there. But you've got a world where water is scarce and expensive, and to a certain extent kind of rationed. The characters are often worried about as they reach the end of a hot season, will they have enough money to afford to have water to drink, stuff like that. The nature of where they live at changes how they dress. And one of the things that you talk about a lot is that they have head coverings, they have face coverings, they have this, so they have essentially this kind of like veil that they're pulling close across their face and keeping knotted. I'm assuming is keeping the sand out and keeping their face protected from the sun and the heat and everything. But it has the effect of having a culture of people who don't see much more of each other than just their eyes, unless there are slaves and servant classes that do have their heads uncovered. But it means that the culture has a certain embarrassment about emotion in public because they are so covered up that it's not something they express very often. And so you have a character who's very, very observant and picks up on a lot of body language stuff and has to pay attention to that because, there's mentions where he'll notice somebody is smiling, but he can't actually see their mouth, right? Or at least not visibly. So, how do you work with those elements and how do you explain that through the character's eyes, how he can observe those things, even if a lot of the usual physical cues are not quite as on display as what we might think of it from an American standpoint?
So it was just the men who wear toggles, the women and the slave class. That sounds like that's on a the same level. They don't wear toggles. And then the men, it depends on where their station is, how high up on their face, how much of their face they cover, how much of their emotions they're willing to show. But yeah, it was definitely, I had to be very, very aware of how much I was describing in terms of emotions and how much you could actually see at any time. Thankfully, eyes are very expressive. You can tell when somebody is not smiling with their eyes, when they're just kind of doing the fake smile. And you can tell when somebody's just kind of amused. And so, especially with Amastan, he does have a tendency to be able to pick up a lot more on details than a lot of his other cousins. So it's a lot easier for him to read into those emotions and to read other people than perhaps they can read him, which is very helpful as an assassin, even though he doesn't really want to use that. But yeah, a lot of it was just trying to be very aware of how much he could see at any time. And also you can tell a lot by tone of voice too.
Right, yeah. And I think when, we talked about the whole, like, it turns into kind of a detective story, if there is something that Amastan has going for him, that is that he is obsessive about details. He's essentially kind of goes undercover for a while, trying to find out some information about who might have killed this, like, war chief. And I was struck by that idea of this guy who is kind of socially awkward, very nervous, but also exceptionally competent, having to use like a false name and trying to strike up conversations with people and figure out how to lure information out of them in conversation with somebody who is not necessarily the greatest conversationalist to begin with. I just thought about, like, I'm extroverted. So me, the idea of like going out and engaging with people is totally normal. But I keep thinking about Amastan as like a mega introvert and how this has to just like really work against his nature to have to go do those things. And I think that creates an interesting sense of conflict as well. Like, so when you were writing that, was that a thing you were thinking about where like, oh, I'm putting this character in just the most uncomfortable position I can?
I mean, to be fair, that's what we usually do as writers. But yeah, no, I definitely, in the back of my head the entire time, I knew that what he wanted more than anything was to just go back home, go to his scrolls, and sit there in the quiet for as long as he could. And he wanted nothing to do with any of that. So it is a special kind of torture for him to have to go out and to extract that information from people and to be sociable in that way and to eventually flirt. So
when I remember, like, even the first time where flirting as a concept comes up and he just has that like, oh no, oh God, I hate this. Like, I don't want to do this. And yet at the same time is kind of flushing and having those like, I'm having weird feelings. I don't understand what's happening. Like, again, like I said earlier, like, it is kind of a coming of age story. So, which is not how you imagine your killers most of the time.
He's an assassin, but he still has emotions, not a serial killer.
Right, exactly. Not a serial killer. That's an important distinction for sure. I do want to backtrack to what you mentioned earlier, because I feel like a lot of the writers had still had to be exploding about it. The idea that the sequel, at least in the sense of how it's being published, The Impossible Contract, is really what you wrote first. So can you kind of walk me through how that happened, how you wrote that book, but that's not ended up being the one first published, that you had to backtrack to a different story? To me, that sounds like really, really fascinating and also kind of terrifying.
Honestly, it kind of was. So The Impossible Contract, I actually wrote it to be a standalone. And I wrote it in response to a lot of things. And one of the things I wrote into response to was reading a book that had abruptly ended and was the start of a series. And I did not realize that at the time. I thought it was standalone. So I wrote it to be self-contained. And then it went on sub. And then the publisher came back and was like, we would really like this, but we'd really like this to have 2 more books somehow, please. And I was like, oh, I have no idea how to do that. But thankfully, my agent had actually kind of gotten the idea in my brain that that was a thing that could happen and prepped me with like, you should probably think of like a 1-line sequel idea or 2 sequel ideas. And I was like, I really don't think there can be 2 sequels. And she's like, well, a prequel idea. And I was like, okay, that could be a thing. And then so when they came back and they asked basically for a trilogy, I was like, I feel like this is important because it kind of explains my mindset at the time. I had also just given birth 2 weeks before. So I was exhausted and a little out of it and not really thinking. And so I was like, you know what would be a good idea? I would like to do a prequel. And they're like, I guess that works. Sure, let's do that. And so I was like, okay. And then I went 2 weeks later and sat down and looked at my computer screen and was like, what did I just sign up for? So it was definitely like I'd mentioned before, I knew that there were events that had occurred in the past for The Impossible Contract, and there are still past events for The Perfect Assassin. So there were events that ended up informing a lot of The Perfect Assassin and Amastan's Journey. So in that regard, I did have a starting point, but literally like day one, I named the document Amastan, and I started writing like November 1st and really had no idea where I was going. I just vaguely knew that it was going to be about him and that I was going to have to answer a lot of questions. At the same time, I'm really incredibly grateful for that, being able to go back and like really build out the world more and really build out the characters, because like Mena did not exist in the Impossible Contract originally, and several other characters didn't really exist. And there are some characters that are just mentioned in passing in the Impossible Contract that I got to more fully explore in The Perfect Assassin, and then again get to more fully explore in the third book. It was very much kind of a godsend for me to be able to just like go back and like really dig into the world and understand it a lot better. So I'm very glad I got to go back and write a prequel, and I would not recommend writing the second book first, because then you do have to go back and like wonder what the heck you did and match all that up. But honestly, the most surprising part was that I went and wrote the first book, and then I had to do the edits on the second book, and a lot didn't change. I apparently was able to do enough in the first one where I didn't have to do much more than tweak things in second book.
That was going to be my next question, was to see like if it had evolved a lot because of that. Because if there's one thing that, at least like when you look at like films, if they have a series and you do get a prequel to it, they oftentimes don't align quite perfectly. I mean, I guess the best example is Star Wars, right? Like you go into the prequels and you look at like, okay, they wanted to flesh out this world, but they created a lot of dissonance with the ones that came later, as far as timelines don't quite match up and character motivations don't quite go along. And then you've basically made things that people said later kind of a lie. It just doesn't quite work. And at least in this case, it's you wrote the prequel, and the second book, the thing it was the prequel to had not actually come out, so you had that ability to make those changes. But that is interesting that you were able to do it without having to make some very big alterations. But that, I mean, that brings me to like, I want to talk about like your craft and process then, because I want to know how you outline, if you outline, like, because I really do want to know how you went from that second book to the first one, and like where you were finding, you know, going back through your notes and figuring that stuff out.
You're not going to like the answer.
Oh gosh. I'm excited to even hear that sentence.
So my outline is basically a 60,000 word first draft. And then I kind of just keep the rest in my head. So I did end up making a Bible of sorts, where like I listed out the characters by book and their age and what they looked like. But aside from that, I just mostly kept most of it in my head. Like I went ahead and wrote all of the first draft, and that was my outline. And then I wrote my official outline for my editor at that point, back and revised it. Yeah, and then it was just keeping an eye on the things that I knew I would have to change when I went and started doing edits on the second book.
So are you more of a pantser then? Like, are you just jump into that first draft and just go, and that's your discovery phase?
Yeah, so I usually start with a really, really clear first image of some sort, and then I generally know how it's going to end, although with The Perfect Assassin, I honestly did not figure that out until like the second or third draft. Probably because I was a bit sleep deprived at the time, because I was writing this with a newborn. That's my excuse. I'm sticking to it.
I mean, that's a very, very good excuse. Yeah.
Yeah. I usually just pants it, and then I have this mess, and then I figure out the order from the chaos.
J. Michael Straczynski was on the show a couple episodes ago, and he talked about how he never writes an outline first. He writes the first draft of something and then writes the outline based on that and then sends that in, because he's like, it'll be complete garbage otherwise. Like, he's like, I have to write the story first, and then I can distill it down to an outline. That sounds a little bit like what you had there. How many drafts did you go through on each one of these then in order to get them to where they needed to be?
So about 4 drafts for The Perfect Assassin. That includes draft 0, which is basically that messy draft. And the Impossible Contract, I think, was also about 4. So I usually do one terrible, terrible messy draft, and then I turn it into something that is not terrible. And then I turn that into something that's slightly less terrible and give that to betas. And then I revise after that and hand it over to my editor. That's been the process so far. So, I mean, that's kind of how the last book worked too.
So if you're going through that process, it sounds to me that you're probably, I mean, are you just working in Word or another like word processor, or like, yeah, what do you use?
Yeah, I use Word. I've tried Scrivener about 3 to 4 times, and every single time I start out really enthusiastic and end with never again. Um, but I just, even though I'm a chaotic pantser, I'm very linear in the way I write. So it's just easier to open a Word document, just go straight through, and then save it, and then open a new one, and basically go straight through again. So
When you're writing in a linear fashion like that, if you run up against a wall or you run up against a problem where you're like, maybe there's a continuity issue, or you're just like maybe struggling for a moment trying to figure out where it's moving or, how to solve a problem, what do you do? Like, if you're not jumping ahead or doing things kind of out of order, how do you reframe and fix that problem?
well, usually I go for a walk. That usually helps a lot with figuring out where the issue is. Sometimes I just steamroll ahead. Sometimes I'll put in a little note to myself that I actually just did that with the draft I was working on, where I moved the entire scene from one place to another place without going back and rewriting it, because I can do that in the next draft. So it's, for me, the most important part for each draft is to get all the way through to the end, because otherwise I will have a tendency where I will keep rewriting the first few chapters and they will be great, and then I'll try to write the next few chapters and it will be crap. It's just very hard to continue on for that. So it's much easier if I can just go straight through and just write complete crap, and then go back later and figure out all the continuity errors. With the Impossible Contract, very first draft I wrote ended with rocks falling and everyone dying. Like, sometimes that's as far as I can get, and that's the end. And then I go back to the beginning again and rewrite it.
That feels like a deleted scene, where it's like, oh, the original ending, everybody just died. Total party kill. Whoops.
Yeah, DPK.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that almost happened in the first draft of Perfect Assassin, except it was kind of like a standoff where everyone was just staring at each other, not sure what they were supposed to do. And I was like, I'm going to end it here because we're never supposed to get to this point.
Yeah. I had a story I was trying to write for NaNoWriMo years ago, which I've still never completed one of those and never won Nano. But I wrote a scene I'd imagined in my head for years, and the characters got together, stood in a room, and just looked at each other. And I was like, well, this doesn't work. Let's just throw this away because this conversation is not happening and this doesn't function. But at least I was early in it. If you're getting to the end and being like, oh, I'm in the third act of this or fourth act or whatever. But yeah, like to hit that moment and be like, oh gosh, they have nothing to do here, or I don't know how this works. You're going to have to take a couple of steps back and rework that.
Sign that you aren't in the right place too.
Yeah. I mean, since you're pantsing with it, are you thinking about a specific kind of structure, like whether it's 3-act, 4-act, Save the Cat, any of those kinds of things? Or is it something maybe you work towards in the later drafts? You're making a face at me where you're like, I'm about to tell you I don't do a damn thing like that.
Yeah, no. I mean, I just kind of go with the feel of it, of like, does this feel like it's dragging? Does it feel like it needs more action? Does it feel like it needs to calm down a bit? Honestly, I've never read Save the Cat. I have an idea of what the 3-beat structure is, and I feel like I should probably be reading more up on that, but a lot of it just goes into like feeling it out. And then on a reread, feeling where it drags and where it seems like it needs to start working towards some sort of reveal or reversal or something. But I'm never that intentional about it.
I love it. As nobody will be able to see this in the actual audio version, but every time when you're talking about those things, you're giving that like sheepish face, like, well, I just said that out loud. Everybody knows now.
Writer credentials revoked at this point.
Well, fortunately, there's no rules, right? So it's all good, but it's terribly amusing. In the editing process, then, are you doing anything different as far as like how you do the edits? Like, I mean, a lot of writers are changing the font or changing the colors or printing it out or things like that. So like, what's your particular process in that?
Yeah, so usually I start out with like 12-point font with no spaces between them. And then when I get to the second or third draft, I'll change the font and add like 1.5 spacing. That does make it a lot easier to read through it again like it's new and to be able to catch a lot more stuff. Also, when I edit with each draft of editing, I basically write a new outline because that much has basically changed at that point, and it helps to clear up where the ghosts might be, in a draft. Basically, those are things that have happened in prior drafts that you have edited out, or explanations that you've shortened, and being able to go back and see exactly what is actually on the page versus what's still in your head or haunting the page is very helpful, and that's doing another outline again is very useful for that.
I really like that you mentioned the sort of apparitions of previous drafts, because there's a few times recently where I have read books where I feel like I've run across one of those. I always think of it as like a dangling participle, right? Like just a piece lying there that's like apocrypha in the story. And at one point, like I was reading a draft and it was reading a book and it was on Kindle, so I was able to like do like a search. And it mentions this character, and the character is not mentioned anywhere else in the novel. And I had that like, oh, this is left over. And somehow through editing and stuff, it just never got found. I mean, it's a fairly rare thing, at least in traditionally published, where it is going through a lot of hands. But sometimes it feels like there's a more aggressive kind of publishing schedule happening these days, where like it used to be the idea that like if you got a book out a year, you were doing great, but it really wasn't happening that fast most of the time. Now I feel like there's an acceleration where to keep it in front of readers and keep people excited, a year or less is almost necessary in certain markets, I would say. And I think there's a greater chance of those things happening. So how are you tracking those things, like specifically, like how are you finding them and going, oh gosh, okay, this needs to get pulled out? Is there a methodology for that?
Well, my final draft, after I've done my editor's edits, and before I actually send it back to her for the final time, I read it aloud. That, for me, has been the most key thing in finding those kind of inconsistencies, because your brain just treats it very differently when you read it aloud. It forces you to slow down and also hear the cadence of the sentences. It forces you to hear echoes. It forces you to hear really awkward stuff that you probably don't want like an audiobook narrator saying or something like that. But that's honestly been the most key thing that I've found that has helped with finding ghosts. That's been finding last minute editorial issues, words spelled wrong. That almost never happens at that point, though. And I would advise most writers read their stuff aloud at the final stage.
I would advise people do that when they're tweeting, because I think that would probably make a lot more of Twitter make more sense if people would just read it aloud first.
Well, some of us are tweeting while the baby's asleep, so we can't read it aloud.
That's fair. That's very fair. Okay, I will give you that. Also, probably the people who are tweeting at 3:00 in the morning maybe don't want to wake up their household by like politically ranting at the top of their lungs or coming up with that great viral pithy statement that maybe will catch fire.
Although, to be fair, that would still probably help if they just stopped and realized maybe I shouldn't be saying this aloud at 3 a.m.
That requires a certain level of self-actualization that is not rampant in today's society.
Yeah. We'll work on that first.
Yes.
Then we'll tackle Twitter later.
Oh, maybe we just burn it down. I think that might be the easiest and most efficient way to handle all of that.
Would we have to burn down the servers? I wonder about, like, how would we do that practically, though?
I mean, EMPs are really effective for just taking out all that stuff. As a podcaster, that's probably not a great thing to be excited about. My livelihood exists online and has for the last couple of decades, so maybe I shouldn't be super keen about those ideas, but I don't know. I definitely have some social media-driven despair at times.
We'll just put a pin in the EMPs for now.
Right. Worst case scenario, right? Yeah. Is there other media, stories, books, movies, TV, podcasts, things that are like influencing your writer brain right now? Whether it's just that you're excited to jump into, or the things that you're using to kind of inform your thought process for your next projects?
Well, I did mention Serpent Cast podcast. I especially like listening to them because they are very good at deconstructing not only books that have just come out or books that have been out for a while, but also fan fiction. And I really appreciate them tackling that and then tackling the tropes that fan fiction uses, and then also looking at how those same tropes are used in regular fiction. So it's kind of like just bringing those two things together helps me understand some of my own writing more, because I do come from a fan fiction background originally. That's how I got a lot of my experience back in the day, 2 a.m. writing Sailor Moon fanfic. Anyway, now that I've announce that. I'll be gone. No.
You're like probably like author number 7 on my show to talk about being a fan fiction author. So yeah.
Yeah, it's not really a new thing anymore, which honestly I'm really jazzed about the fact that like so many authors can talk about having been fan fiction writers now. Like it's not a shameful thing at all. Anyway, aside from that podcast, I am trying to get my roots back into epic fantasy. So I've been reading Jen Lyon's Ruin of Kings, which is ruining me. Sorry about the pun. But it's just kind of fun fantasy again with like really different world building things I haven't seen in a while, and bringing a lot of disparate elements and characters and viewpoints and threads together in a way that I haven't really read in a while. And maybe that's just because I haven't been reading those kind of things, but it's been inspiring me and making me want to go back to writing epic fantasy one of these days.
That book is so intimidating to me. I have it, but it's a doorstopper.
Yeah.
You know, it's huge. And then also like there's footnotes in it.
Oh, yes.
And the combination of being very large and having footnotes just, I don't know, scares the crap out of me for some reason. And because of just the how quickly I have to read in order to do the interviews and stuff for the show, novellas and shorter books are way healthier for me. And so when something like that comes along, I'm like, I'll get to you in a couple of years.
Yeah.
Sometime. Or like over summer or over winter break or something.
So the chapters are actually really short. It's actually a pretty fast read for that thick of a book. Like it takes me a week or 2 weeks to read a normal sized book. And that one's only going to have taken me 2 weeks.
Oh, okay. That's not too bad then. Yeah.
Yeah. You can move it up a little bit.
Okay.
Of course, the second one comes out, I think in October. So
what? Already?
Yeah. She's also on an advanced schedule like me. Hers are going to come out every 9 months.
Oh my God.
Yeah, she's working on the fourth one.
I don't even know that just freaks me out.
I don't either. She's a machine. Jen is a machine.
And I've followed her like Instagram, and I've seen, because she does like the bullet journaling and stuff. Like she's a graphic designer and does these like just beautiful like daily journals of stuff. I'm like, how can you be that effective and then still have time to make a pretty journal alongside of it? My to-do list looks like chicken scratch, and it's a giant mess, and her stuff is gorgeous.
Yeah, I just don't even try to get to that level. I have to just give up at some point, you know.
A person has to know their limitations, right? I see the people who are able to crank stuff up that quickly and do whatever, and I'm like, that is amazing. I am a person with my own gifts. I just don't have those, so I will choose to be in awe of them rather than biting my nails in jealousy.
That's all we can do, though. I try to at least pretend I have the excuse of having a child, so she sometimes works as an excuse.
That's a pretty effective one, just a little bit, yeah. Did we miss anything in there? Was there any other stories or anything that you were thinking of?
The problem is I haven't been able to read as much, and then in terms of like TV, the kind of things I'm watching right now are toddler appropriate. So I have watched a little bit of She-Ra.
Which is great.
Yeah, she seems to enjoy it, as well as Baby Shark about 100 million times.
Oh, God. I had only heard whispers of Baby Shark until I listened to a podcast that's called Decoder Ring that actually explained the origin of Baby Shark, where that came from and its global phenomenon. And so now I know, I mean, I can summon that little jingle in my head from it. But thankfully, like, I've never been exposed to it in the real world outside of that podcast. So you have my sympathies. Absolutely. So all those things aside, The Perfect Assassin is out now from Tor. The Impossible Contract, the book you wrote first, is coming out November 12th. And then you have a third one coming, right?
Next year.
Like you said, kind of like accelerated release cycle.
I actually put it in March.
Oh, wow. So you're way ahead.
Yeah, I'm done. I'm just coasting from here on out.
That's a good feeling, right?
It kind of is, yeah.
I mean, maybe scary when you're going to the next project because like the momentum that you had, like you had 3, but now they're in the bag. And so you're moving on to the next thing. But
yeah, clearly I can't do anything ever again.
Well, you do have a toddler, so
it complicates things.
It's an interesting switch from when you have people who are in the traditional publishing world and the people who are in the indie world. The ones who are writing in independent publishing are like putting their books out on the market. Like it's like the book is done and it's finished and it goes live like a day later or something, or like on a schedule, versus in traditional publishing where you might submit something in March and have a full year go by before anybody actually sees it. Granted, arcs go out a lot earlier or people get to see them in different ways. But I imagine that's got to be delayed gratification. Like, do you have that same level of like, it exists in the world when it's been a year separated from it?
I mean, especially for book 2, which I wrote in 2014. It isn't coming out now till 2019. It's been 5 years.
Oh my God. You don't even know these people anymore.
I know, right? No, but there's going back through the edits and being there as people start reading the arcs. It is kind of like rediscovering an old friend. So there is kind of a joy in that. And I do still get really excited. I'm still excited about The Perfect Assassin, even though I wrote it like 2 years ago now and it came out in March. But I think that excitement continues because it's like every new person who comes in and experiences these characters with you kind of makes them a little bit more real. So their enthusiasm is basically bringing life to these characters that have sat in your head all these years, and they don't just go away just because you finished that book or that book has come out and you're done.
So yes, you get another delayed gratification session in a couple of months, and then a couple more months after that. So that's nice.
It's kind of nice.
Where should people be following you online in order to keep up with the release schedule for these new things, and to know about the next projects coming up?
So they can find me on Twitter, where I am most active and probably too active at KA_Doore, and that's Doore with an E on the end. Or otherwise, I have a website that's kadoore.com, and I do actually monthly update my blog and any information about my books on there.
And I will say, from the standpoint of a online content creator, that I highly appreciate your press kit on the site. I mumble about this every once in a while on the shows, but it's super helpful whenever an author actually has all of the tools there ready for the people who are talking about them and supporting them online. So I always like to see that. So other people who are listening to this, go to your website and see how it's done, because it's really good. And I really appreciate that there.
I actually have Dan Stout to thank for that, because I think I was listening to his episode and you mentioned something about that. And I was like, oh, I keep telling other people to do that, but I haven't done that myself yet. Thank you, Dan. That should be Titan Shade.
Yeah, Titan Shade, great novel, and yes, great press kit on his website as well. So yeah, it's like you guys are setting good examples out there. So hopefully those things will catch on, because this is it's a symbiotic relationship between authors and publishers and the people who are talking about those things online. So it's like we all have to help each other. We're all like, it's rising tide, right? So those things are super helpful. So that is awesome. Well, Kai, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on the show. The Perfect Assassin is an excellent novel, and like I said, defies a lot of expectations, which for a reader like me is exactly what I'm looking for, because I don't like to read the same thing over and over. I like things that are fresh, interesting characters, new worlds, and people who take me in directions I wouldn't have expected. So I'm hugely appreciative of that. And people should be looking out for The Impossible Contract. And then, do you know when you're going to talk about the name of the third one, or start hinting about those things?
It's on Amazon already. Well, you can't order it on Amazon, but on the blurb for The Perfect Assassin is the name and the date. So it's called The Unconquered City, and it is supposed to come out in June 2020. I don't have a precise date yet, but somewhere in June.
Well, awesome. Well, we'll be looking out for that, and thank you so much for being on Fictitious.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
This was Season 4, Episode 5 of Fictitious. Every episode of the show is available at fictitiouspodcast.com, along with news and events, articles, and book reviews. Listen and subscribe to Fictitious on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify, or search for the show using your favorite app. Stay connected to all things Fictitious on Twitter or Instagram, where you'll find us as @FictitiousPod. You can also chat about books, fandom, and other nerdy things with me on my personal account @AdrianBusky. If you like the program, please share Fictitious on social media, tell your friends, or write us a review. All those things support the authors who appear on the show, and you'll help me to expand and improve the podcast. Next week, author Katie Rose Poole discusses her debut young adult fantasy novel, There Will Come a Darkness. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'm Adrian Busky. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.